There is a building on the east side of Route 9, past the pecan orchard and the church that closed in 2003, that my daughter has driven by roughly 4,000 times in her life and never once asked me about. It doesn't look like anything. Corrugated steel, a gravel lot, a padlock the size of my fist. If you saw it, you'd think feed storage, maybe old farm equipment. You would never guess that what's inside that building is worth more than every house on my daughter's street combined, and that I built it, piece by piece, appraisal by appraisal, secret by secret, over 31 years. My name is Corinne Baptiste. I am 63 years old. I have restored furniture and appraised estates for half of Chatham County, and until 4 months ago, I believed that the biggest secret I would ever have to carry was the one in that building. I was wrong. The bigger secret walked into my daughter's life, wearing a good watch and calling himself Preston Hale. And by the time I understood what he was already her husband. I want to tell you how this happened, because I think somewhere in this story is a mother you recognize, or a daughter, or maybe a version of yourself standing at a kitchen counter at 11 at night, staring at a phone, trying to decide whether the feeling in your stomach is instinct or cruelty. It started on a Tuesday in March with a phone call I almost didn't answer. "Mama, I have news," Simone said, and I could hear the smile in it before she said another word. My daughter has a particular voice for good news, higher and quicker than her ordinary voice, like the words are trying to get out ahead of her breath. "I'm engaged." I set down the drawer pull I'd been cleaning, a 19th century brass piece off an estate sale in Pooler, delicate as a moth's wing. And I said all the things a mother is supposed to say. "When? How? Let me see him. Send me a picture right now, Simone. Don't make me wait." She sent 3 pictures. In the first, a tall man in a blue blazer stood with his arm around my daughter's shoulders on a restaurant patio, both of them laughing at something outside the frame. In the second, he was on one knee in what looked like a hotel garden, and Simone's hand was pressed flat against her mouth. In the third, just his face, close up, smiling directly at the camera the way people smile when they know exactly how good they look doing it. Preston Hale, 38. An investment consultant, Simone told me, though when I asked which firm, she said he worked independently, building his own portfolio of clients. He'd grown up in Charlotte, moved to Savannah 2 years ago, met Simone at a fundraiser for the literacy program where she teaches 3rd grade. "He's different, Mama," Simone said. "He listens. He remembers things I said weeks ago. He wants to meet you so bad." I want to be honest with you about something, because this story only works if I am. I did not distrust Preston Hale because of some maternal radar going off in the first phone call. I distrusted almost nothing. I was happy. My daughter had been engaged once before, at 26, to a boy who cheated on her twice and blamed both times on her working too much, and I had spent 3 years afterward watching her rebuild her confidence one careful brick at a time. To hear her laughing on the phone, breathless with a good kind of nervousness, was the sound I had been waiting years to hear again. So no, I did not feel it coming. I felt relief. You have to understand what my daily life looked like at that point, because it matters later. I ran my restoration shop out of a converted garage behind my house on Habersham, 6 days a week, hands stained with tongue oil, radio on low, the particular quiet of a woman who has built a life entirely out of things other people threw away and things other people never knew they had. Simone called me most evenings around 7, after her 3rd graders went home and before she graded papers, and those calls were the spine of my week. I had buried a husband, raised a daughter alone in a 2-bedroom rental until the year everything changed, and spent 3 decades quietly turning grief into a business, and a business into something larger than either of us had ever spoken about out loud. I was, by any outside measure, a careful woman. I locked my doors twice. I kept receipts for things other people threw away after a week. And still, somehow, none of that carefulness made me suspicious of a man my daughter loved, because carefulness and suspicion are not the same muscle, and I had spent 30 years building the wrong one. It would be another 6 weeks before the first small stone landed in my shoe, and even then, I almost didn't notice it because it arrived disguised as a compliment. Preston Hale came to Sunday dinner in April, and I will tell you, he was good. Not good in the way a con man in a movie is good, all slicked hair and a wink at the camera. Good in the way that made you feel foolish for even having the thought. He brought a bottle of wine I actually liked. He asked about my work before I'd finished setting the table, and when I mentioned I'd spent that morning restoring a mahogany secretary desk from an estate in Ardsley Park, he leaned forward like I'd told him something fascinating instead of something most people's eyes glaze over hearing. "How do you even know what something like that is worth?" he asked. "Is there a book? A formula?" "Some of both," I said. "Provenance, condition, maker's marks, what the market's doing right now. Mostly it's 30 years of looking at things closely enough to notice what's wrong with them." "That's incredible," he said, and he meant it, or he performed meaning it so well that the difference stopped mattering. "Simone said you've been doing it since before she was born." "Since she was 6, I said. "Her father died young. I needed something that paid, and I was good with my hands and better with old furniture than with old grief, so I made a business out of it." He nodded slowly, the way people do when they're filing something away rather than simply hearing it. I didn't think anything of it at the time. Grief invites that kind of careful nodding. It was only much later, lying awake at 2 a.m. with a legal pad and a highlighter, that I understood he hadn't been filing away my grief at all. He'd been filing away the fact that I had spent 30 years accumulating value in a field most people don't think to ask questions about. Dinner went well. Simone glowed the entire evening, the particular glow of a woman watching 2 people she loves get along, and I let myself enjoy it without complication, because complication hadn't shown itself yet. Preston helped me clear plates without being asked, which is a small thing, and I noted it the way you note small things about a man your daughter is going to marry, filing it under evidence of good character, the same way I would come to file other, smaller things under evidence of something else entirely. Months before I understood, I was building 2 separate columns in my head without meaning to. He came back the following Sunday, and the one after that, and by the 3rd visit, he'd learned the names of my regular clients, remembered that I took my coffee black after 6 in the evening and with cream before noon, and asked Simone, in front of me, whether her mother had ever thought about scaling the restoration business, opening a second location, monetizing the expertise properly. Simone laughed and said I'd never once in my life used the word monetize, and Preston laughed too, easily, the laugh of a man comfortable being gently teased. And I laughed along with them because it was funny, and because I had no reason yet to hear anything underneath it. The second Sunday of real substance, though, the one that mattered. He asked me what I thought my collection was worth. He asked it lightly, over dessert, the way you'd ask someone what they thought their house might sell for in this market. A normal question, a getting-to-know-you question, except that I don't talk about my collection. I have never talked about my collection, not to friends, not to church, not to my own late husband in the 2 years before he died, when I was quietly building the beginning of it out of grief and fear and a stubborn refusal to ever again be the kind of woman who has nothing put away. "What collection?" I said, and I heard my own voice go flat and careful in a way that surprised me. "Simone mentioned you've got a storage place," Preston said easily, spooning peach cobbler onto his plate. "Old furniture, family pieces. Sounds like it could be worth something, is all. I do this for a living. Helps to think in terms of asset diversification. No offense meant." I looked at my daughter. Simone was watching him with the soft, unguarded face of a woman who saw curiosity where I was starting to see something else. She'd mentioned the storage building to him. Of course she had. It was the most natural thing in the world for an engaged woman to mention her mother's storage building to her fiancé, the way you'd mention any ordinary fact about your family. Simone did not know what was in that building. She knew it existed. She had never once, in 31 years, asked to see inside it, because I had built a life around her, never having a reason to ask. "It's mostly junk," I said, and smiled, and changed the subject to the wedding date, and felt something in my chest tighten that would not fully loosen again for 4 months. I should tell you why that building exists, and why I never told Simone about it, because if I don't, you will start to think I'm simply a secretive woman, the kind who hoards things out of some private hunger. And that isn't the truth. The truth is more complicated, and it starts with my own mother. My mother, Odessa, cleaned houses in Savannah for 40 years for families who never once, in 4 decades, learned the names of her children. She was quiet about money the way some people are quiet about grief. Not because she was ashamed of it, but because she had learned early that a Black woman with visible money in 1970s Georgia was a target for family and strangers both. She saved. She bought small things at estate sales that white families were selling off for nothing because they didn't know what they had. And she held on to them. And she never told a soul. Not even my father. Not even me. Until she was dying. When she died, we found the safe deposit box. $61,000, 3 pieces of jewelry worth more than our house, and a stack of stock certificates going back to 1979 that had split and multiplied into something that changed my life the week I turned 32. And along with the money came something else, a grief I hadn't expected, a strange, twisting anger underneath the gratitude, because I had spent my whole childhood believing we had nothing, and it turned out my mother had spent 30 years lying to me about it, gently, completely, out of love that I understood but couldn't entirely forgive. I swore, standing in that lawyer's office at 32 years old, that I would never do that to my own child. I remember driving home that day and pulling over on the side of Victory Drive, just to sit with the feeling, because it was 2 things at once and I didn't have a name for either of them yet. Gratitude so large it felt like grief, and grief so specific it felt like anger. My mother had scrubbed other people's floors for 40 years so that I would never have to, and she had done it in total silence. And some nights, lying awake afterward, I found myself furious at a dead woman for loving me in a way I hadn't been able to see or lean on while she was alive to give it to me. I didn't want Simone to ever sit on the side of a road doing that math about me. And then, 4 years later, my husband Elias died of a heart attack at 41, standing in our kitchen with a spatula in his hand. And I found myself exactly where my mother had stood, a widow with a small child, no safety net, and a decision to make about how a woman protects herself in a world that does not protect her. I remember the first year after Elias died with a strange, underwater clarity. Simone was 6. I was running a restoration business that barely covered rent, and I was terrified in a way that lived in my body more than my mind. A low, constant hum of terrified, the kind that makes you check the locks twice and read every bill twice and count your bank balance in your head while you're supposed to be listening to your daughter tell you about her day. That fear is what built the storage building, if I'm honest about it. Not greed, not secrecy for its own sock. Fear, and my mother's money, and a talent for spotting value that other people walked past. I used part of the inheritance to rent the building on Route 9 the year Simone turned 7, cheap, out of the way, paid in cash the first 2 years, because I didn't trust banks the way my mother hadn't trusted them either. Inherited suspicion passed down like a piece of furniture nobody chose, but everybody keeps. I filled it slowly. An estate sale here, a foreclosure auction there, a Chippendale highboy I bought for $400 off a family in Isle of Hope who had no idea what their grandmother had left them, restored over 8 months of nights, and sold 2 years later for $11,000 to a collector in Charleston. I did not spend that money. I put it back into the building and into the small brokerage account Dominic's predecessor helped me open, and I watched it grow the way you watch a garden grow when you're too frightened to look away for even a season. I did not lie to Simone the way my mother lied to me. I told her, from the time she was old enough to understand, that Mama had a storage building where she kept pieces for work. That was true. What I didn't tell her was the scale of it, that over 3 decades, using my mother's inheritance as seed money and my own eye for value as the engine, I had built a collection of restored antiques, rare furniture, and a small but real portfolio of investments that, as of the appraisal I'd quietly commissioned the year before, was worth just over $1,400,000. I told myself I was waiting for the right time. Her wedding, maybe. The birth of a grandchild. Some milestone that would make the reveal feel like a gift instead of a shock. I told myself this for years. The way you tell yourself you'll clean out the garage eventually. And I believed it, mostly, right up until the moment a man I barely knew asked me what my collection was worth over peach cobbler. And I understood, with a coldness that started in my hands and moved up my arms, that I had waited too long, and the wrong person had found out about the building before my own daughter had. I did not stop the wedding. I want to be honest about that, because a version of this story where I marched in with evidence and objections at the altar would be a more satisfying story to tell. And it isn't what happened. What happened is that I spent the 6 months before Simone's wedding watching Preston Hale very, very carefully and finding almost nothing, because he was careful too. He never asked about the building again directly. He was smart enough to know that one clumsy question was already one too many. Instead, he built a version of himself for Simone that was patient, generous, endlessly attentive. He paid for things, small and large, in a way that made Simone feel cared for and made me watch his spending with a professional eye that had spent 30 years learning to spot money that didn't come from where people said it came from. He drove a car worth more than his stated income should have allowed. He talked about clients he never named. When Simone mentioned, once, that she'd like to see his office, he laughed and said his firm worked remotely. Mostly, no need for an office. And she believed him the way you believe someone you love, which is to say completely, and without the part of your brain that a stranger would use. I hired a private investigator in August, 4 months before the wedding, and I told no one. Not Simone, not my sister, not my closest friend of 30 years. I told the investigator, a retired detective named Ruth Okafor, who I'd worked with twice before on estate disputes, that I wanted a full background check, quiet, thorough, no contact with the subject. What Ruth found took 3 weeks and cost me $2,000, and it wasn't enough. Preston Hale, it turned out, was his real name, and he did work in some form of financial consulting, though the licensing was thin and the client list was thinner than he'd implied. There was no criminal record. There was no obvious red flag, no smoking gun, nothing I could put in front of Simone that wouldn't sound like a mother's jealous suspicion dressed up as due diligence. There was, however, one strange thing. A previous marriage, 4 years earlier, in North Carolina, to a woman named Delphine Ash Whitmore, ended in divorce after 14 months. Ruth couldn't get the settlement details. They were sealed. But public records showed Delphine had filed for divorce herself, quickly, and the case had been resolved with unusual speed for a contested marriage. There's something else, Ruth told me over coffee at a diner off Abercorn, sliding a folder across the table the way she always did, face unreadable in the manner of someone who'd spent 30 years as a detective learning not to editorialize her own findings. It's thin. Might be nothing, but his employment history has a gap. 18 months between leaving a firm in Charlotte and starting up whatever he's calling his business now. And the Charlotte firm he lists on his old LinkedIn profile? They have no record of him, I called. They were polite about it, but they'd never heard the name. I asked her what that meant, and she shrugged in the particular way of someone who has learned that a fact by itself rarely means anything, and only means something once you have 3 more sitting next to it. Could be a title he never officially had. Could be he padded a resume the way half of Savannah pads a resume. I'm not going to tell you it's a smoking gun, Corinne, because it isn't. I'm going to tell you it's a loose thread, and loose threads are the only thing worth pulling on in this line of work. I sat with that fact for 2 weeks. A first marriage, ended fast, record sealed. It could mean anything. It could mean he was young and made a mistake. It could mean nothing at all. I did not have enough to bring to my daughter 3 months before her wedding, not without risking the one thing I feared more than Preston Hale, which was Simone deciding that her mother would rather destroy her happiness than trust her judgment. So I did what I do for a living. I waited, and I watched, and I kept the receipts. I almost told her the week before the wedding. I sat in my car outside her apartment for 20 minutes one evening with the engine off, rehearsing sentences that all sounded, in my head, like the confession of a woman trying to sabotage her daughter's happiness 3 days before her wedding. Every version came out wrong. I have a building full of money I never told you about. And also, I hired a detective to investigate your fiancé. And also, I found something strange in his first marriage, but nothing I can prove. There is no way to say those 3 things to a bride 4 days out and have any of them land as love instead of chaos. So I didn't say them. I went inside instead, helped her steam her dress, and told myself that whatever I found in the next 4 days, I would act on it the moment I had something solid enough to act on, wedding or no wedding. I found nothing solid enough in those 4 days. I have turned that fact over many times since, wondering if a better mother, a braver one, would have said something anyway, imperfect and unproven, and let Simone decide what to do with an unfinished fear. I still don't know the answer. I only know what I did, which was wait, the way I had already spent 31 years learning how to wait. The wedding was beautiful. Simone wore her grandmother's pearls, my mother's pearls, the ones from the safe deposit box. And when she danced with Preston under string lights in a garden in Thunderbolt, I stood at the edge of the reception with a glass of champagne I wasn't drinking, and I made myself a promise. If he was what I feared, I would find the proof. And when I found it, I would not let it destroy my daughter along with him. Trouble doesn't announce itself. It arrives in small requests that sound reasonable, one at a time, until you look up and realize you've been slowly rearranged. 3 months into the marriage, Simone called to tell me she and Preston were talking about restructuring their finances for efficiency. His phrase relayed through her with the particular carefulness of a woman repeating something she doesn't fully understand but trusts. He wanted to combine their accounts. He wanted her to add him to the deed on the small rental property she owned, the one she'd bought with money I'd helped her save, the one that was hers alone. He said it was standard for married couples, that keeping things separate created tax inefficiency and signaled distrust in the marriage. And Simone, who had never in her life had reason to be suspicious of anyone who loved her, said it made sense when he explained it. "Did you sign anything?" I asked, keeping my voice as level as a countertop. "Not yet. He wants to do it before the end of the tax year." "Mama, why does your voice sound like that?" I told her it didn't sound like anything, that I was just tired, and I got off the phone and sat in my workshop among unfinished chairs and stripped-down tables until the sun went down, thinking about my mother's safe deposit box and the strange grief of loving someone and not trusting the way they love you. Between those 2 calls, in September, Simone invited me to a barbecue at their new house. The house Preston had insisted they buy rather than rent, building equity from day one, financed in a way that Simone described to me in pieces she didn't fully understand, and I didn't press her on. Not yet. I watched him that afternoon the way I watch a piece of furniture I suspect has been refinished to hide damage, looking for the seams, the places where the surface didn't quite match what should be underneath it. He was attentive to Simone in front of other people in a way that read as performance once you started looking for performance, touching her lower back when someone new arrived, repeating little facts about her. She runs the book fair every spring. She's been trying to get a garden started for 2 years, in a way designed to be overheard and admired rather than simply lived. I told myself I was being unfair. A man can love his wife visibly. A man can also learn to display love the way he'd learned to display everything else about himself, and I did not yet know which one I was watching. The second crack came in October, smaller and stranger. Preston asked me, at a family dinner, whether I had a will and whether Simone was the sole beneficiary, and whether I'd ever considered setting up a trust for tax purposes. He asked it warmly, wrapped in concern, the way you'd ask a mother if she had enough support at home. But I have spent 30 years reading intentions in the careful, over-casual way people ask about money, and I heard, underneath the warmth, a man doing reconnaissance. I have a lawyer for all that, I said. Good one. Handles everything. Smart, he said, and smiled, and the conversation moved on, and I went home that night and called my lawyer, Dominic Reyes Okafor. No relation to Ruth. Savannah is a small world, and told him I wanted to restructure my estate plan immediately, quietly, in a way that protected Simone's inheritance from anyone who might one day have legal standing to make a claim on her marital assets. It was the third crack, in November, that told me the wall was coming down faster than I'd planned for. Simone called me on a Thursday night, and her good news voice was gone. In its place was a voice I hadn't heard from her since the last time a man broke her heart, careful and small. Preston wants me to ask you something, she said, and I don't. Mama, I don't even know how to ask it, so I'm just going to say it how he said it. He wants to know if you'd consider making him your medical power of attorney, in case something happens to you. He said it would be a way of showing I trust him fully, since I'm your only family, and it would fall to me anyway, so it might as well be official through him too, since he handles that kind of paperwork professionally. I sat very still in my kitchen, phone against my ear, and understood, in the space of about 4 seconds, that the man had stopped circling and started closing in. Simone, I said, I need you to listen to me very carefully, and I need you to not be angry with me for what I'm about to say. I told her everything that night, not on the phone. I drove to her house at 9:30 in the evening, sat her down at her own kitchen table, and told her about her grandmother's safe deposit box, and the promise I'd made in that lawyer's office at 32, and the 31 years I'd spent quietly building something I always meant to give her, and never found what I thought was the right moment to reveal. There's a building on Route 9, I said, past the orchard. You've driven by it your whole life. It's mine. It's full of restored furniture and pieces I've collected since before you were born, and an investment account your grandmother's inheritance seeded. And Simone, baby, it's worth just over $1.4 million, and I never told you. And I am sorrier about that tonight than I have ever been about anything. She stared at me across the table for a long time. I want to tell you her first reaction was gratitude or relief, but it wasn't. It was hurt. A raw, immediate hurt that came out sideways, the way hurt does. You let me struggle, she said quietly. The year I couldn't make rent after Marcus left. You let me sit in this kitchen and cry about money, and you had $1 million in a shed. I did, I said, and I did not defend myself, because there was no defending it, not really, only explaining it. I was scared, Simone. My mother's silence broke something in me I never fully fixed, and instead of fixing it, I built my own version of it and told myself it was different because I loved you more carefully. It wasn't different enough. I'm sorry. Why tonight? She asked finally, and there was an edge in it I understood completely, because it was the same edge I'd carried out of my mother's lawyer's office 31 years earlier. Not last year. Not at the wedding. Not any of the 400 dinners we've had at this table. Why tonight, Mama? Because I'm scared, I said, and it cost me something to say it plainly, the way it costs anyone something to say the true thing instead of the comfortable thing. I have spent 31 years telling myself I was waiting for the right moment, and the truth I didn't want to look at is that there is no perfect moment for a thing like this. There's only the moment when staying quiet becomes more dangerous than speaking. I reached that moment tonight on the phone when you told me about the power of attorney. We sat with that for a while, the two of us, the kitchen clock ticking through a silence that felt like it might not end. And then I told her the rest of it. The real reason I was telling her that night, 4 years and 1 wedding later than I'd planned, was Preston, the private investigator, Delphine Ash Whitmore, the sealed divorce records, the medical power of attorney request that had finally told me the timeline had run out. "You think he's after the money," Simone said. "Not a question. I think," I said carefully, "that a man doesn't ask to combine finances in month 3, ask about my will in month 6, and request medical power of attorney in month 8 unless he's building towards something. I could be wrong. I have been wrong about people before. But I am not willing to be wrong quietly anymore, not after watching my own mother teach me what silence costs." Simone didn't cry, which surprised me. She sat very straight in her chair, the particular straightness of a school teacher who has spent a career learning to hold her composure in front of children, and she said, "I need to see the divorce file, all of it, and I need to see the building." Ruth Okafor got us more than the sealed record. She got us Delphine Ash Whitmore herself 3 days later on a video call from her home outside Charlotte, a woman in her early 40s with tired, careful eyes who spoke like someone who had rehearsed this story to herself many times and never once told it out loud to anyone who could use it. "He found me on a dating app 2 months after my husband died," Delphine said. "I want you to understand that first. I wasn't lonely and vulnerable in some abstract way. I was a 40-year-old widow with a life insurance settlement and a house paid off, and he found me 4 weeks after the funeral, and I didn't understand what that meant until much later." She told us the marriage moved fast, the way ours had. Combined accounts within 4 months. A request to add him to the deed by month 6. By month 11, he'd convinced her to liquidate part of her late husband's investment portfolio into an account he managed for tax efficiency. And by month 14, when Delphine's sister flew in for a visit and started asking pointed questions about where $40,000 had gone, Delphine finally looked at the statements herself and understood that her husband had been slowly, patiently, legally draining her for over a year. "I didn't have a case," Delphine said. "That's the part nobody tells you. He never took anything I hadn't technically agreed to. Every transfer had my signature. I filed for divorce because I couldn't prove theft, only bad judgment on my part, and my lawyer told me a fast, quiet settlement was the only way to salvage what was left before he found a way to get the rest. I've spent 4 years telling myself it was my fault for trusting him. It wasn't until your investigator called that I let myself say out loud that it wasn't." Simone asked her the question I hadn't wanted to ask, the one that had been sitting under my ribs since Ruth first said the name Delphine Ash Whitmore out loud. "Did he ever hit you? Threaten you?" "No," Delphine said, and something in her face made it clear the question wasn't a surprise to her, that she'd been asked it before and understood exactly why people needed to ask it. That's what made it so hard to explain to anyone, including myself. He was never cruel. He was patient and warm and endlessly reasonable, right up until the day I looked at 4 bank statements at my sister's kitchen table and understood that reasonable had cost me $41,000. Cruelty would have been easier to point to. This was just erosion. A little bit, gently, every month, until you looked down and the ground you were standing on wasn't the ground you started with. She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice had steadied into something closer to warning than confession. Get everything you own that predates him into your name only, in writing, before he asks you to combine one more thing. That's the only advice I have. Don't wait for proof of malice. By the time you have proof, most of what he wants is already his. Simone was quiet for a long time after that call ended. Then she said, "He's not going to get anything of mine the way he got hers. Not because I'm smarter than her, because I have you, and she didn't have anyone who thought to check." That was the moment, I think, the actual turning point of this story, though it didn't feel like triumph. It felt like grief. For Delphine, for the version of Simone's marriage she'd believed in for 8 months, for the 2 years I'd have given anything to still have with her stepfather, who would have known exactly what to do with a man like Preston Hale and would have enjoyed doing it. Here is what 30 years of appraising estates teaches you that no lawyer can. Paper tells the truth, even when people don't. Every provenance claim, every maker's mark, every restoration history is a paper trail. And paper trails don't lie the way people do, because paper doesn't care about your feelings. I spent the next 3 weeks building a file the way I'd build a case for a disputed estate, methodically, without emotion, letting the documents speak instead of my suspicions. Ruth Okafor helped me trace the North Carolina divorce settlement through public court records that, once unsealed by Delphine's own request, showed a pattern eerily close to what Preston had already started with Simone. Combined accounts, deed additions, a power of attorney request that Delphine had, thankfully, refused. Dominic, my lawyer, cross-referenced Preston's independent financial consulting business against Georgia licensing records and found something Ruth's initial background check had missed. A cease and desist order from 2021, filed by the Georgia Secretary of State's Securities Division for operating as an unregistered investment advisor. It had been resolved quietly, a fine paid, no criminal charges, the kind of paperwork that disappears into a filing cabinet unless someone with a reason to look goes looking. Dominic read the order aloud to me over the phone in his flat courtroom voice, and I sat at my workbench with a half-restored chair leg in my hand, listening to language about unregistered advisory activity involving 3 Georgia residents, and felt something settle in my chest that was almost relief, the relief of finally having a shape to put around a fear I'd been carrying without a name for. 8 months. 3 residents, I repeated. Not 2. Not 1. 3. Georgia doesn't publish the names in a cease and desist, Dominic said. Just the count. But Corinne, 3 separate people trusted this man with money in an unregistered capacity in this state alone before he ever met Simone. That's not an unlucky pattern. That's a method. And then Simone found the last piece herself, which felt right to me, though I hadn't planned it that way. She'd asked Preston, gently, conversationally, about his time in Charlotte before they met, and he'd mentioned, in passing, a company called Ashford Capital Advisory that he'd consulted for. Simone looked it up that night and found that Ashford Capital Advisory had 1 listed employee in state business filings, Preston Hale, and had been registered 8 months after his divorce from Delphine finalized, using an address that matched an apartment complex, not an office. There was no crime in any single piece of it. That was the thing I had to explain to Simone, sitting at her kitchen table with the file spread between us like an estate she was preparing to walk away from. He hadn't broken a law that we could point to and hand to a prosecutor. What we had was a pattern, a documented, repeatable pattern of a man who found women recently widowed or newly wealthy, married them quickly, and spent the marriage patiently, legally, moving their assets into structures he controlled until the marriage ended and the money mostly didn't come back. That's not enough to arrest him, Simone said. No, I agreed, but it's enough for you to leave him with everything that's yours still in your name, and it's enough for a judge to understand exactly why you're asking for it, if it comes to that. Simone did not confront Preston the way you might expect, and neither did I. And I think that restraint is the part of this story I am proudest of, because it would have been so easy, so satisfying in the moment, to throw the file at him across a table and watch his face change. We didn't do that. We did something quieter and, I think, more permanent. Simone met with Dominic alone first, on a Tuesday afternoon while Preston believed she was grading papers, and had him draft a postnuptial agreement. Not a confrontation, not an accusation, simply a document, presented calmly over dinner 2 nights later, that formalized what should have existed from the start. Her rental property remained solely hers, her existing accounts remained separate, and any future estate inheritance, including anything from her mother, would remain her sole property regardless of the marriage's outcome. Preston's reaction told us everything the file couldn't prove. He didn't ask why. He didn't act confused or hurt the way an innocent man surprised by sudden formality might. He got very calm, very quickly, in the specific way of a man recalculating, and he asked for 2 days to have his own lawyer review it. And during those 2 days, Ruth's contact confirmed that he had opened a preliminary consultation with a divorce attorney in Charlotte, not Savannah. The exact pattern he'd run once already, quietly preparing an exit that would look, on paper, like it was Simone's idea. Simone told me about the dinner afterward, sitting in my workshop with a cup of tea going cold in her hands, and she recounted it in the careful, measured way of someone replaying a scene she wanted to remember correctly. She said he read the document twice, slowly, and then set it down and asked her, very quietly, whether this had been her idea. She told him the truth, that it had been her idea, built with her mother's help, because she'd finally understood that protecting what was hers wasn't the same thing as distrusting him. It was simply what a grown woman did with property she'd owned before he arrived. He didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He asked for 2 days, the way I told you. And in those 2 days, something in the house went quiet in a way Simone said she felt more than heard, like a radiator that had been humming so long you only notice the sound when it finally stops. He signed the postnuptial agreement 11 days later, with the flat, controlled face of a man who understood he'd been closed out of something before he could finish opening it. He filed for divorce 4 months after that, citing irreconcilable differences, and walked away with almost nothing beyond what he'd brought into the marriage, because there had been almost nothing to take. Simone did not fall apart the way I feared she might. She grieved. Of course she grieved. You don't spend 8 months building a life with someone and walk away unscathed just because you were right to walk away. But she grieved with her eyes open, in a way I don't think I managed after her father died. And I think some of that clarity came from finally knowing about the building on Route 9 and understanding that whatever else was uncertain in her life, there was a foundation under her that had been there the whole time, even when she didn't know to look for it. I took her there in February, 6 weeks after the divorce filing. I unlocked the padlock myself, the way I had 11 times a year for 3 decades, and I watched my daughter walk into a building full of restored secretaries and Chippendale chairs and a small fireproof safe holding stock certificates older than she was. And I watched her understand, all at once, the shape of the inheritance her grandmother had started and I had spent a lifetime finishing. "You built all this," she said, "and you were going to just give it to me one day, like a surprise." "I was going to give it to you the way my mother gave it to me," I said. Except I learned something my mother never got the chance to learn, which is that a surprise like this isn't a gift if it comes too late to protect you when you needed protecting. "I'm not waiting anymore, Simone. Half of this is yours now, on paper, this year, not someday," she cried then, finally, standing in the middle of that steel building with dust in the afternoon light, and I held my daughter the way I hadn't since she was small, and I thought about my mother and about Delphine Ash Whitmore, 3 states away rebuilding a life she'd once thought was stolen from her for good, and I thought that maybe the lesson underneath all of this was simpler than I'd spent 30 years making it. Love isn't a secret you protect. It's a door you eventually have to open, and the only real question is whether you open it yourself, on your own terms, or whether you wait until someone else forces it and lose the choice of how the story gets told. I opened mine. Late, but before it was too late. And if you're sitting somewhere right now holding a secret you've told yourself you're protecting someone by keeping, ask yourself honestly whether you're protecting them or just protecting yourself from the moment you finally have to explain why you waited so long. Simone still drives past that building on Route 9 most weeks now, except she has her own key. And last month, she brought her 3rd grade class's spring project out there instead of storing it in her classroom closet. A set of birdhouses the kids built from scrap wood, lined up now on a shelf between a Chippendale highboy and a steamer trunk that once belonged to a family none of us will ever meet. She told me it felt right, putting something small and hopeful in a building that had spent 30 years holding on to things people were afraid to lose. I didn't tell her that was exactly why I built it. Some things a daughter should be allowed to discover on her own, in her own time, standing in the dust and the afternoon light, deciding for herself what a room full of old, protected things is actually for. Some doors close on their own if you leave them long enough. I got lucky. Mine was still open when I finally walked through it. If this story reminded you that the people who love us quietly are sometimes the ones protecting us the most, subscribe to the Second Bloom Chronicles, because every week we tell another story about the women who waited, watched, and finally spoke. Next week, a story about a woman who discovered her late husband's business partner had been rewriting the books for a decade. You will not want to miss it.